share a bit of that with you, where we came with this.
So I'm not an expert on sex, nor am I an expert in sexual communication. But I think a lot about social justice and how communication can, in both little and grand ways, lead us to a more just world. And so, as Pat has said, sexual encounters are a place for extraordinary violence, but extraordinary human thriving. So I have humorously titled my talk, How to Be Good in Bed. Maybe it's not that funny. So I'd like to focus on an unfortunately very common phenomenon. It's a gray area in the sexual violence spectrum, and it is consented, unwanted sex. Let that sink in for a second. It's unwanted sex that the person consents to. Now, it's not rape by the legal definition because consent has been provided, but it still has powerful and negative effects on the physical and psychological health of the person who experiences it. There's lots of studies about how prevalent it is. One study I found said 95% of adult women say that they have had some sexual experience that they weren't interested in but they agreed to. Others put the number closer to 40 when talking about actual sex. It ranges all over the board and everybody samples differently, so it's hard to compare, but suffice it to say it happens a lot. Now, what does it mean? Let's go through a couple of distinctions. There's willing but unwanted. So I'll let you, but I don't really want to. There's also wanted, but unwilling. I want to have sex right now, but I choose not to. There's also desiring sex, but not the consequences. So I really want to have sex, but I want to deal with what happens because of it. And there's also desiring the consequences, but not wanting sex. Finally, the last distinction is there are different parts of sex, the time spent, the physical closeness, the sexual sensation. So you could want some of it, but not the others. And there are also various consequences, relational, social, reproductive, and health. And you could want some of the consequences and not the other. So it turns out, here's the technical term, it's complicated. Which is why some scholars advocate for us moving beyond simple yes or no discourse into a discourse of ambiguity. Now, I realize what are the ways in which you would like to have sex tonight? It's not really a sexy pickup line, and it doesn't really roll off the tongue, but it's important to shift our thinking about having sexual interactions. Now, the complicated reality is compounded by the fact that there are various pressures that bear down on us when it comes to giving consent. Now, some of them are direct and communicative. It turns out that verbal violence, explicit threats of violence, or physical violence accounts for 3 to 4% of consented unwilling sex. So that's not really it. It's not that we're bullying each other into have sex. Really, we're pestering each other, it turns out. Partner conveying interest, even though persistent physical attempts, disregarding protest, is actually the highest number. It turns out you might not be as seductive as you think. You could be annoying and coercing your way into bed. And that is a thing that I say with some degree of levity is actually extraordinarily crippling when you really take the time to think about why actually your partners are choosing to sleep with you. It also turns out that deceptive statements and statements of affection also mark the kind of direct reasons that people will consent to sex that they don't want. But there are also more indirect pressures, and I'm going to save you an elaborate lecture by saying that there are relational, cultural, and gendered performance reasons. The relational pressures that we exert, implicitly, the pressure to have sex to maintain a relationship, or the fear of infidelity if I don't. There's having sex for the sake of your partner, because you know they want it even though you don't. There are cultural pressures. There's a virgin whore dilemma that exists that women face a lot, and I don't have time to get into right now, but you're sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't with regard to sexual performance. There's this expectation we're supposed to have sex in and around special events. Oh, it's graduation or whatever, New Year's Eve, and we're supposed to have sex now, even though maybe neither of you actually want to. And there are also group norms. We exert an extraordinary amount of pressure on each other. Finally, there's gendered performances, so discourses of women's submissiveness, or the discourse of male unstoppability, or the idea that achievement or potency is tied up with the sexual act. And so it's usually at this moment in this whole elaboration that I'm about to vomit, because this all kind of makes me really sad. that these are, we're not even talking about that somebody got beat up in an elevator and it made the news. We're not talking about, the cops got called. We're talking about two people who are in a relationship that they describe as love, but they get pressured, both directly and indirectly, into having sex with each other when they don't want to. But fortunately, all hope is not lost, because the same communicative realities that tie the knot can untangle it. So there are countless communication strategies Professor Alden and I are discussed, and I'm going to choose to focus on just two: listening and reframing. I'm not going to lecture you on listening. Go Google it, look at your interpersonal communication text. But there's a distinction between surface and depth listening. What is the overt message, but what are the subtler message that I really need to know you in the context in order to understand? We make a distinction between objective and empathic listening. What are the facts that you are actually saying, but how do I think you feel about it, right? And then there's this process that Pat alluded to, which is active listening, which involves paying attention, connecting up different meanings, trying to understand the other, stating a summary, this is what I think you just said to me, and asking if I understand. So armed with the distinction of willing but not wanting, wanting but willing, wanting sex but not its outcomes, or wanting its outcomes but not the sex, wanting parts of sex, wanting parts of the others, armed with those distinctions, listen actively to your partner. Pay attention to their energy levels, their pauses, their nonverbals, their word choice. Don't always assume there's a secret message you have to decode. Listen to what they're actually choosing to say you to, and put that all together. Ask them, tell them what you're hearing, and ask them if they understand. The other strategy I'll go briefly into, I'll call a relational reframing. Here's the thing. We operate under relational, cultural, and gendered pressures all the time. You can't actually escape that. But you can choose to reframe our relations with our sexual partners under different frames. So be more strategic about the gendered, cultural, and relational frames you choose to evoke. So for instance, I would submit to you that try to adopt the disentangling wants frame. And open the conversation with your partner to say, there are all sorts of reasons to want to and all sorts of reasons to not. Could we stop saying I do or I don't, and here's why I do and I don't. And let's work through those. Another frame, and I'll only touch on this briefly, this is a rule in my own life, not to overshare. I'm going to overshare. I was wandering around the internet one day and I found this meme and it said, only have sex with another person if they want to as much as you. And that really got inside my head and kind of crawled around, and it sort of lived in a place where I started just saying that to my partner. Where I would ask, would you like to have sex? And they would say yes, but some part of that active listening would recognize in me that I thought I got an ambiguous yes. And I would say, I'm really only interested in having sex with you if you pretty much are pretty down for it, because I'm pretty down for it, and that's the rule. And it turns out that it was very helpful in reducing the pressure I implicitly put on my partner, while at the same time it made me feel less shame because I was co-authoring the decision not to. Does that make sense? So instead of the rejected male, I was the conscientious community decision maker, which, if you know me, I also have that part as part of my identity. So it's not a perfect rule, and I would say that it doesn't pass Kant's categorical imperative, but it moves in the direction of mutuality, or this question of human thriving. And I really do believe that through pro-social and strategic communication about sex in our relationships, that we can become more human. Now, I titled this talk, How to Be Good in Bed, and I meant it in that ethical sense. That it is possible that if you listen to what I say, you're going to have less sex. And that's funny, but it's possible the reason you will is because you currently are exerting unknown pressure on your partner to consent to you. But while I titled this talk, How to Be Good in Bed, and I meant it in its ethical sense, I'll bet you really will get better in bed, because there's a decent chance that if you have sex with people who want it, they'll like it more and they'll think you're better at it. So